Welcome back to RSA Conference 2021. This is Security Weekly. We are live streaming in Virtual Broadcast Alley. Joining me for this segment, good friend, Sandy Carielli. She's Principal Analyst at Forrester. Welcome, Sandy.
Hey, Matt. Great to see you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's fun to have you back. Sandy and I used to work together at RSA back in
the day.
Couple versions back. We were just talking about how we missed the hills and the bridge run, even though we never did the bridge run.
I never
at
did
RSA.
the bridge run.
Yeah.
I should not do the bridge run.
But we all got our exercise walking back and forth to Union Square and back this week. Instead, we all get to sit at home, or in my case, in the studio, to have this great interview. We're going to talk API security, this is a good favorite topic of mine. App user data. App has a lot of components to it. API security being one that's getting a little more attention based on some recent attacks. So give us a quick update on what's been happening in the API security world, and then let's dig into, well, how do we solve API security?
Yeah, so the problem we've got here, Matt, is that API security breaches are becoming so common that, not a week goes by where you don't hear about a couple of them. The joke could almost be, okay, there was another API issue, must be a day that ends in Y. It's that common. And APIs are really useful from a business and development standpoint. They allow organizations to reach their customers in new ways, come up with new revenue streams, new lines of business. But there has been, I think, a lack of realization of the organizational responsibility to protect the APIs in the same way that they had to protect traditional applications. And that has unfortunately led to a lot of data leakage. I could definitely give you a bunch of stories. I don't know if you want me to dive into like the Experian issue from a couple of weeks ago. That was a good one. Yeah,
I think it's an interesting story because it kind of highlights some issues around this, like who owns API security? Is it who wrote it? And we could even get into more granularity, like, well, is it the app team? Is it the security team? I think it's a really good use case to start from.
Yeah, that actually does lead into some good questions. But let's start with sort of what happened. So a researcher discovered an API that was exposed on one of Experian's partners' website. And the researcher found that when he entered some very basic user information, I think it was name, maybe date of birth, maybe address, nothing particularly identifying, not having to do any sort of authentication beyond that, he could get the credit information of that individual. And what they discovered was that it was Experian making an API available to this partner, who was in turn making it available to customers on their website. So basically, it was going straight through the API, making requests to Experian, getting a lot of very sensitive customer credit data that you wouldn't want people to get for you. And when the researcher reported this to Experian, their response wasn't to lock down the API, require additional authentication around it, which would have been the right thing to do. Their response was to cut off that particular partner's access to the API. The problem with that, Matt, as you can guess, is that we don't know who else has access to that API, who else might be presenting that publicly, who else might be making requests and getting credit data that they shouldn't have. So that's where it really comes back to. It's Experian's responsibility. It's the responsibility of any organization that is developing the API, making it available. They're the ones that have to lock it down. You can't depend on the user to lock it down. It's your job.
Now, you bring up probably the first issue with API security, which is authentication and authorization. API should be authenticated and provide authorization levels to use the API. In this case, that was missing in this particular use case.
And that seems to be a really common issue with a lot of these API breaches. When they are providing more data than they should be, when you have a data leakage issue, often it's because anyone can make the request on the API. You're not having to authenticate, and it doesn't require you to prove that you should have access to the particular data. There was a interesting data leakage issue about a year ago when India launched their COVID-19 contact tracing app. And they had similar authorization issues. In this case, I think it was an authorization issue where The idea in theory was that you should be able to, if you were standing somewhere in the country, you should be able to see what the COVID status was in your immediate vicinity. But people were able to, manipulate the parameters from across the world, say, I happen to be standing here. And that would allow you to see the COVID status of any household in India from, your safe position in Europe or the US.
So now you bring in point number 2, which is understanding how your APIs actually work and what kind of data they have access to, and how do you lock or potentially lock down that access, because these are standard parameters that are available probably in the API definition. Somebody found the information and said, oh, by the way, if I just put in this field or in this parameter,
no
I'm
one's going to challenge me.
Right. Yeah.
No, that's exactly it. All of those issues that we're talking about, they're things we've talked about with application security since time immemorial, right? It's authentication, it's authorization, it's data validation. We know how to perform these. We know what happens if we don't. But because APIs are, more distributed and a little bit different, we kind of forgot.
Yeah, I mean, the OWASP Top 10 talks about all these issues, right? And there's been a list of them out there running all the time. And so, yes, they're still out there. We know what they are, but now you have to apply those to a different aspect of the application, right? It's not just about my core app, my core capabilities, but I also wrote all these APIs to interface with other services, maybe a mobile app. But we were not running them through the same kind of testing mechanisms for all these other variations or use cases of the app.
Well, and there's a discovery issue here as well. From the security standpoint, are you even aware of all the APIs that are running in your environment? Do you know what's out there? Do you know what's connecting to which applications? And do you have a full sort of view of that in order to actually do the relevant protections?
Well, yeah, that assumes you've discovered them, but you also have them well documented, so you know, even if you find them and find those endpoints, like what can they actually do? Like what parameters can I pass to them, et cetera? And I know there's been a lot of solutions that have been coming onto the market to address aspects of API discovery, API definitions, API security.
And, we're starting to see some of those tools expand the discovery to actually, as they're analyzing the API behavior, be able to map out some of the data usage and parameters that are expected. That's still new, though. And it does need to continue to evolve. It's not a universal feature across, all application security tools or anything but like that.
Yeah, and we're also seeing API security functionality showing up in a couple unique markets, right? We know that the application security folks are doing aspects of this, like the web app firewall folks are also looking at APIs. We've also seen the identity and access management players move into aspects of API security as well. So it's not only coming from the AppSec vendors, it's also coming from the identity vendors.
It absolutely is. And when you think about all the different aspects that you have to put an API through, it kind of makes sense, right? We mentioned earlier that authentication and authorization are two of the major fails that we see in protecting APIs, that a lot of the breaches have been due to that, lack of appropriate access control or authentication. So it makes sense to have the IAM elements in there. And then from the WAF standpoint, a lot of what they're doing is, analyzing the parameters. It's more of the standard data validation or looking for OWASP Top 10 types of issues. So that plays an important role as well. The other piece of this is going to be in the pre-release testing, actually scanning the APIs, understanding what they do, and looking for any gaps in those definitions. So there is the whole range of API security controls, just as there's the whole range of application security controls. You're not going to have one single tool that's going to solve all this for you. I wish I could say otherwise, but...
Yeah, and you bring up two very interesting angles on the app side, right? You've got pre-deployment, which is, can I do some level of validation testing prior to release? But then you've got the whole dynamic component on the runtime when it's actually running in the environment. And I've even seen mobile vendors start to move into the space a little bit too, because on the mobile application side, most of that communication, if not all of it, is an API communication. And so even some of the mobile app testing vendors are adding some aspects of API testing in there too.
Yeah, it's early stage, I would say. I don't think that there's necessarily, the full suite of mature API security testing, but a lot of vendors in the application security testing space are extending into APIs because they know they have to.
Mm-hmm.
Because ultimately their job is to test an application regardless of how it's built.
Right.
And APIs are how they're built.
Yeah, exactly right. Because it's all these microservice elements all communicating via a set of APIs, and it has to be in that stack. We've seen, I don't want to get into vendor names. I want to kind of provide a roadmap, but we've seen aspects of consolidation around certain application security functionality. We're seeing static, dynamic, software composition analysis all coming together under a single umbrella. You've got standalone API security vendors out there, where I could see some consolidation of bringing some of those API security functionality in, or these bigger players building their own capabilities. The market's going to continue to move, I imagine, because some of these standalone players will get absorbed. Some of these standalone players might still carve out a niche for themselves, maybe. What do you see in the market trends?
So again, without going into vendor names, we have seen a couple of announcements of acquisitions of API security vendors by large established web application firewall and bot management vendors. So we're definitely seeing the consolidation from that direction. And then we are also seeing just extension of functionality in a lot of the WAF and bot vendors, where whether it's by acquisition or their own development, they are extending their support for APIs and API security. Whether that means, being able to, preload the, API specification files into the WAF and be able to generate rules based on the definition of the API, whether that means being able to add discovery tooling into the WAF and scan and develop rules based on how they see the APIs behaving. There's sort of a whole range of functionality that a lot of the web application firewalls are adding as baseline into their offerings. And again, it's not universal. We're not at a consistent place yet, but we're going in this direction where a lot of it is being absorbed.
Yeah. And so if you're out developing your own custom application, your roadmap probably varies based on what existing tools you already have in place, right? So authentication and authorization. Do I have a solution in place in my IAM stack that includes some API protections there? Do I have an existing WAF in place that potentially has some capabilities for API security?
Yeah.
Or, do I have none of those and I need to think, either point solutions or more holistically?
The other piece of it, Matt, is the API gateway, which is somewhat tied into the IAM stack because a lot of what the gateway is doing is authentication, authorization, but it's also going to perform functions like rate limiting and sort of manage the speed and volume of traffic for APIs, which is another element of this whole thing. So you have to add that layer in. The API gateway usually is something that's sold alongside of a broader API management solution, which is more for the developer. So, there are all these different pieces coming together, some of which are security buy, some of which are a dev buy, some of which are more, pre-release testing, some of which are more security operations. So you're putting all these different pieces together, different stakeholders, different components. I often say it's a patchwork. Unfortunately, it still kind of is. It's spreading a little bit more, so there are fewer gaps, but it goes back to, there's no one ring to rule them all here.
Yeah, and then let's add one more wrinkle to this, because now we got the cloud providers, right? So now I could have a cloud provider being my API gateway. And what do I need to do in those environments where, the API gateway functionality might have some protections in it, but I still have to do pre-release and or real-time monitoring, and maybe I don't get them in my cloud API gateway?
Entirely likely. The pre-release side, isn't really covered in any of the gateways today. So you really are going to have to do something separate for that. It's going to be more about integration with your SAST tooling, with your DAST tooling, with your IaaS tooling, and then having the gateway in place, having any cloud protection and having the WAF. So, you really have to look at this as, beginning to end, start of development all the way through the life cycle, and how are you protecting the APIs at each phase of the life cycle? Similar, going back again to how we look at applications more broadly.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, if the application vendors can do a really good job of integrating API security components into the various sides of the build, ship, run process, then it gets a little easier because maybe you only need 2 or 3 tools instead of, all your AppSec tools plus your API tools on top of that, right?
Yeah. It's going to be interesting to see how this market develops. I think what we're seeing a lot of the existing application security tools extend to include APIs where maybe they didn't 5 years ago. And APIs just become, another way to build applications, and the tooling is going to have to extend to support that. But there is still a place right now for standalone API-specific solutions also. So you end up with these layers.
Right. Yeah. Is there a good reference guide for people to kind of take a look at on the Forrester website that'll give them a little guidance on what they should be looking at in their overall strategy for API security?
So I'm going to recommend 2 things. One is a Forrester resource, and one is just an OWASP resource. On the Forrester side, I did put out a report last year with David Mutter on API security. We did a webinar as well, and covered a lot of aspects of the range of tooling that is available today, the niche that each piece fills, talking about needing to manage APIs from design all the way through deployment and from client all the way through to the infrastructure. So that's one really good place to look. I would also encourage people, you mentioned the OWASP Top 10 earlier, there is an OWASP Top 10 for API, and it does delve into some API-specific security issues. So if you're not familiar with that, that's also a really good starting point.
Great resources. Sandy, thank you for joining us on Security Weekly.
Thanks. I hope everyone has a great conference.
We hope so too. And with that, we'll take a quick break and then come back with one more interview for today.